In my last video I discussed the history of the Antifa and the current situation here in Germany, as well as in Sweden and in the US. Now we will have a look at a first-hand experience of the movement and then at what can be done about it. Steve, a former Antifa activist whom Stéphane Molyneux interviewed in August 2017, calls the radical left, quote, an absolutely vicious, toxic, abusive hate culture, end quote. And he now defines himself as a conservative. What triggered him to change his mind so fundamentally? Steve started out as an anarchist. He describes the seducing power of being an anarchist activist. A lot of anarchists are addicted not just to alcohol and drugs, but also to rage and violence, he says. He is himself a recovering alcoholic. Directing your hatred against everyone in society gives you a rush of power that feels like a drug. Regular rules don't apply to you because you're above them. US Antifa members tend to admire the Spanish anarchists of the 1930s, he says, in spite of the fact that these people committed mass murder, mass rape of nuns and murder of priests after having forced them to watch parodies of the Mass. Not just communists, but anarchists as well are often huge fans of Marx, because anarchism doesn't go deep enough as a theory. Consequently, Steve started to read the communist classics, Marx, Lenin and Stalin. He discovered that Lenin was dreaming of transforming the Soviet Union into one big factory, and when he came to Stalin's speeches, he started to recognize language and ideas not just from his own movement, but in the radical left as a whole. If you remove references to Trotsky and exchange the word class in texts referring to the Moscow show trials for race, gender and sexual orientation, you will find that the same thing is happening today, he says. People with a different viewpoint are not allowed to say anything in their defense. The difference is just that the left doesn't talk about class anymore. As a leftist, you think you're a rebel fighting against the dominant culture, but eventually you discover that you are the dominant culture, he says. He found out that what he believed in was being pushed by the people in power, and that the media had been feeding him a pack of lies, like lying about black people to protect them from criticism. What the mainstream news media like ABC News and CNN reported was all false. Instead of critically exposing the establishment, they were pursuing the same radical left narrative he himself had. Steve and his leftist buddies were nothing but the establishment's idiot shock troops, he says. There are serious and well-meaning people in all movements, including in the left, Molyneux comments. And these leftists certainly want good things, they are just ill-informed. But with people who want bad things and just need an ideological cover for being mean, sadist, violent criminals, but don't want to accept that they are criminals, but instead tell themselves they are freedom fighters for the underclass, there can be no serious conversation. These people don't want what we want, which is what any decent people wants. Instead, they want things at the expense of decent people. Molyneux closes the discussion by asking how violence is justified within the movement. Property destruction is not considered violence, Steve answers. In the Antifa it's called redecorating, so that the feds cannot get them. And the destruction is all planned in advance. Furthermore, the official view in the movement is that violence can only flow down the hierarchy, not upwards. It's like saying that a black person cannot be racist and a woman cannot be sexist, he says. Everyone who opposes them is labeled a Nazi. Some people just want to watch the world burn, Molyneux says, incidentally perhaps quoting Alfred Pennyworth's statement about the Joker in the Batman movie The Dark Knight. They're full of violent and destructive impulses and of self-hatred. Some Antifa who want to do good and who have a conscience can manage to break away from the movement like Steve did. The psychopaths cannot. So what to do about these guys? To find an answer to this, we'll have to look at the Antifa from another perspective. We will have a look at the perspective of a right-wing activist, Martin Sellner, front figure of the identitarian movement in Austria. In his book Identitär, Geschichte eines Aufbruchs, which means Identitarian, the story of a beginning, from 2017, Sellner is being honest. People outside the identitarian movement have no idea of the pressure that is put on members in the form of repression, arrest and legal proceedings from above, and leftist terrorism from below, which is growing more and more vile and fanatical every year. Joining his movement may destroy your career, your relationships and your family. It may lead to outings, policing, defamation and even a risk for your life. The repression from above and the terror from below are both a result of the soft totalitarianism prevalent in Austria and in Germany, which denies Islamization and population replacement, defames all critics and sacrifices them to social death and to the left-wing terror. Total conformism is expected, and whoever refuses to participate in excluding people thinking differently is himself or herself excluded. A head of police may destroy his career by pursuing leftist crimes, because the son or daughter of some well-known politician on the left or a journalist working for one of the major newspapers may be among those accused, and left-wing extremism has an enormous lobby. There are left-wing extremists in Berlin living in government-funded but illegal housing projects, and who nevertheless burn cars and attack police officers while covering their faces, he says. At the same time, the identitarian movement is being accused of so-called cultural racism and so-called extremism of the center, aimed at defaming every kind of patriotic activism. The Antifa aims at the abolition of state, nation, capital and borders and the death of the Austrian people, which means rejecting the core of the constitution, he says. It's a terror organization which would have been prohibited in any state that takes its constitution seriously. The Antifa defend violence and terror against anyone whom they perceive as being a so-called Nazi. He compares the Antifa to the SA in the Third Reich. They turn the right to demonstrate and the right to free speech into a farce, he says. Sellner has himself been a victim of their attacks, physically as well as in outing campaigns, where the Antifa put up posters everywhere in his neighborhood with his picture and the text, "Danger, there's a Nazi living in your neighborhood." Outing is part of the Antifa's terrorist methods. Their aim is not to convince the population of their views, but to spread fear among political opponents and prevent them from being politically active. However, the Antifa's campaigns to defame Sellner have brought him many new friends, he says. One of his neighbors, himself a leftist, was so shocked by the outing campaigns that he completely gave up the left-wing ideology. Repeated Antifa attacks on peaceful identitarian demonstrations and other events have led to an increasing solidarity from the Austrian population. In addition, the leftist terror has the effect of unifying the identitarian movement, because when faced with such threats, differences among the members concerning political and religious views, for example, appear as much less significant. Sellner believes that the Antifa will radicalize further in the next years as a reaction to the left losing its hegemony. They are increasingly adopting an apocalyptic worldview, imagining the imminent rise of a new Nazi empire in Europe. This delusion, stemming from their feelings of powerlessness, will lead them to justify and carry out more and more brutal acts of violence, and Sellner believes a time will come when they will no longer refrain from political murders, like the former Red Army Fraction or RAF in Western Germany. The Antifa will isolate itself more and more from the moderate left and will lose its government funding and its protection from state repression. Many journalists in the established media are in fact eager to report on the leftist terror, but they are not allowed to. Not yet. And Sellner prophesies that this bubble of lies and deceit is soon going to burst. So what is to be done about the Antifa? Anti-Antifa work is meaningless, Sellner says. These terrorists are no political competitors. They are the street troops of political correctness carrying out in practice the media's condemnation of whoever they perceive as being a right-wing extremist by trying to destroy these people's lives. The Antifa is part of a much bigger system, for which reason it makes no sense trying to confront them directly, he says. Antifa activists want to pull the identitarians down to their own level by provoking their opponents to answer violence with violence, terror with terror, which of course would be political suicide for any right-wing movement. The Antifa get away with very serious crimes, especially here in Germany. There is great tolerance for their centers and networks, whereas the identitarians are under constant surveillance from the media. Sellner calls for a strategy of full transparency. This, he says, is the only thing that can lead to success in the long run. In their first actions, the identitarians were covering their faces, but that time has long gone, and they now show themselves openly, which is something that requires great courage due to the dangers involved. Furthermore, they are eager to show the general population that they are normal young men and women with a life and a story of their own. This invitation to empathy, as Sellner calls it, is the worst enemy of the media's demonizing of the identitarian movement. In the next video, we will have a closer look at Sellner's book and the philosophy, aims and strategies of the identitarian movement.